Okay, we've started the recording. Okay, I posted your grades on the second exam to the Moodle gradebook. They were not what I had hoped for. The median score was 59. The high was 78. The low was in the 30s. And I said that you can add 8 points to the grade that you find in the Moodle gradebook. But it was in going over the questions that a number of people missed, it was clear that some really important concepts that significant number of people haven't gotten yet. And in a course like this, I mean, there's certain concepts that you have to get. You have to get it, or you don't pass. And what we're going to do today, I've gone through the exam and questions that a number of people missed that I think are really important for you to understand, partially because you need to understand those topics and partially because it's going to have an impact on your understanding of the future of things. We're going to go through a number of the questions that were on the exam. And on the third exam, well, on the day of the third exam, there will be two parts to it. There will be the third exam, and then there will be probably about 15 questions that not from this exam, but that will be very similar to the questions that we're about to go through. And if you, on those 15 questions that you'll take on the day of the third exam, if you get at least half of those right, then I will add your score on those to basically to exam 2. So in other words, when you take those extra 15 questions, if you get at least 8 of them right, if you get 8 right, then I'll add 8 points to your exam 2 score. If you get all 15 of them right, then I add 15 points to your exam 2 score. So that can really help you out a lot mathematically, and I hope give you a big incentive to make sure that you understand this material. I was talking to a student in another class today that had trouble with an exam, and in going through how this student had approached some of those questions, it was very clear that this person was reading the question and looking for an answer that felt familiar. They could say, "Oh, I remember that." Okay, and so they were looking for something that was familiar, something that seemed plausible. And if that's the way you approach a question, you're doing it the wrong way, because you have to look at each question and assume that you have never seen it before, because a question you could have 2 questions that are identical, except one of them includes the word "not" and the other one doesn't. So the answer is going to be very different, but it looks very similar. So you've got to read carefully. You've got to think about what do these words mean? Not what comes into my mind, what do I associate with it, but what do these words mean? The process you go through in answering these questions is really, really important. Because much of what you learn in an economics class is to read carefully and to think carefully and to reason to a correct conclusion. You're not just simply looking for an answer that jumps out at you. Okay? If that's what you're looking for the wrong thing. You need to read the question carefully, read all the answers carefully, take your time. These questions we're about to go through, the process that I use in going through these, pay close attention to it, and then use that process. Don't try to memorize the answers, because the questions that I give you will not be the same questions, but they will be the same concepts. If you understand these questions, then you should be able to get the right answer on those. Plus, if you approach these questions right, then you're going to be approaching the questions on the third exam and on the final right as well. If you have a question about why I do something as I go through this, ask, whether you're here or whether you're Zooming. Before we get into those, I want to remind you, if you have not turned in your MRU notes, I strongly recommend that you do that, because that can help you mathematically a lot. Also, on the learning curve activities, keep in mind that the grade on your learning curve is 0 or 100%. There's a target for each learning curve chapter. There's a target number of points, and your score is 0 until you hit that target. So if this target is 600 and you get to 595, your score is 0. You get to 600, it goes up to 100%. So I encourage you to go back through your middle grade book, and for the chapters that we've covered, make sure that you've got 100% on those learning curve activities. And if you don't, then finish those up. You may just need to answer a few more questions. This coming weekend, I'm going to close those out, close all the sapling stuff from the first 2 exams. And after that point on, you won't be able to raise your learning curve grade. So be sure to do that before this weekend.
Yes, Professor Jones, I got a question for you.
If you have forgotten how your semester average will be calculated, it is in the syllabus. Remember that 80% of your grade is from the exams, and the sapling and attendance is either 20%, 24, or 26%, depending on whether you qualify for the bonus. And for the bonus, you have to turn in your MRU notes, and you have to have your sapling average up to at least 80%. All right, any questions?
Yes, sir, I got a question. This is Lewis.
All right, well, let's begin with number 4. This is from your exam. And on these questions, if you get to one, we come to one and you say, oh, I made a stupid mistake. Don't ever think of it as a stupid mistake. Think about, why did I get this wrong? Okay? Because if a stupid mistake that you made on number 4 is likely to cause you to make the same mistake on other questions. So the real thing you want to think about is, how can I prevent those kinds of mistakes from occurring? Okay, number 4. The lower the price ceiling is relative to the market equilibrium price, you got to figure out which of these happens. Okay? On any question like this, you want to draw a graph, because the graph helps you to avoid making mistakes. And much of what you learn here is how to avoid making mistakes. And you learn how easy it is to make mistakes. One other thing I wanted to mention, study suggestion. A significant number of you are choosing to attend by Zoom, and that's fine. But I am very much aware, since I've been in lots of Zoom meetings, I'm very much aware of how easy it is to get distracted. If you're sitting in the classroom here, the opportunity cost of paying attention is pretty low, because there's not much else you can do if you're sitting here in the classroom. But if you're at home, there are all kinds of other things you can do, other things you can be thinking about. You can be cooking a hamburger while you're watching the video. I recognize those are temptations when you're in a Zoom meeting, and you can be talking to other people in the room. What you want to remember is that if economics is something that really requires your full concentration, and so if you're in a room with things that are distracting you, you may not understand anything that we're talking about, because you really have to focus on it. And when you don't understand something, you need to stop me and ask a question. So nothing wrong with attending by Zoom. Just be aware that it's very easy to be distracted when you're in your home environment and all those other things that you could be doing. Okay, number 4. The lower the price ceiling is relative to the market equilibrium price. Okay, well, let's put in supply and demand. Put in the equilibrium price. Of course, we know that if we are in equilibrium, quantity supplied equals quantity demanded. What does the price ceiling do? It keeps the price down. It's a maximum legal price. So if we have a price ceiling, then it's preventing the price from going to any level above that. And generally, a price ceiling is imposed below the equilibrium. If the ceiling's above the equilibrium, what does it do? If the equilibrium price of gas is $2 a gallon and we have a ceiling of $3 a gallon, what's the effect of that?
You can't charge more than $3.
It would mean you can't charge more than $3, but if the equilibrium is 2, then producers can't charge more than 2. The price is going to be $2 unless the government prevents that from happening. So if there's a ceiling of $3, that simply means they can't charge more than $3, but they can charge $3 or anything below that. And so a ceiling of $3 would have absolutely no effect, because the price market forces push us to $2. And if the ceiling were above the equilibrium, then it won't have any effect at all. It doesn't prevent us from going to the equilibrium. The ceiling will have an impact only if it is below the equilibrium. Let's say it's $1.50. Okay? And then reading over to the demand curve, quantity demanded. Reading over to the supply curve gives you quantity supplied. So quantity demand is greater than quantity supplied. We have a shortage, and the amount of that shortage depends on where the ceiling is. The lower the ceiling, the lower the quantity supplied will be, and the greater will be the quantity demanded. So if the lower the ceiling is, the greater the amount of the shortage. Nothing complicated about that, but it's easy to get confused. If you follow the process of drawing the graph, thinking through it very, very carefully, then you will not make mistakes. But if you take shortcuts, you will make mistakes. Okay? All right. Let me know when you have a question. Number 10. The price controls of the early 1970s caused, here's a question that deals with content in the book and in the MRU videos, but for the most part, if you know what price controls tend to do, you could figure it out without even knowing what actually happened. Because price controls, what do? Remember, the controls of the 70s were ceilings. They were keeping prices down. And when you have a price ceiling, what does that do? It creates shortages. It causes the quality to go down. It causes misallocation of resources. What were you going to say?
I wanted to take a crack at answering the question.
Okay.
Oh, B.
It is going to be B. Okay. We'll go ahead and look at B first. The disappearance of full service gas stations. One of the things we said was that when you have a ceiling and the government's keeping the price below the equilibrium level, the quality of the product is likely to go down. And quality has a lot of different dimensions. One dimension would be how much service do you get with the product? Well, if you go to the gas station and they fill it up for you at no charge, well, you're getting a service there. When they, because of the ceilings that were imposed on gas in the 70s, one of the things that happened was they stopped providing full service. You had to do it yourself. So that's one example, excuse me, of how when you have a price ceiling, it will lower the quality of the product that is provided. C, gas stations to stay open for more hours. Well, if they're staying open for more hours, that's improving the quality of the product. That's the opposite of what we would expect with the price ceiling. Cause an excess supply of gasoline. No, a ceiling causes a shortage of the product. Okay, so that's not be right. That's not going to be right. Lead to be removed from gasoline. No, that doesn't have any connection at all. So notice you don't look for one answer that say, yeah, that's it. You read every option and you think through exactly what each one is saying. You eliminate the ones that are not correct. You're not simply looking for something that jumps out at you as this is the right answer. Okay? You've got to be willing to take your time in thinking through these questions. That's the way to do well in an economics class. And that's the way to do well in a job. Because if you take shortcuts and you misinterpret things and you come up with a wrong answer, then it doesn't simply mark down your score on an exam, it reduces the profit that your company is going to make. All right, number 15. A rent control is a regulation that A, ensures that there are apartments available for rent. Well, that's a nice thing to happen. We want there to be apartments available for rent, but don't look for an option that says something that's something we'd like. We want to know this regulation, what can we expect it to actually do? Not what's the intention, but what will it lead to? What will it cause? And we've already said that when you have a price ceiling, which is what a rent control is, it's going to cause a shortage. Okay? You need to draw enough graphs so that you don't have to think about what is that graph going to look like. Okay? One of the secrets to doing well in economics is what the psychologists call overlearning. You study the material to the point where you say, yeah, I think I understand that. And then you keep working on it. You keep studying it. You keep doing it until you know it backwards and forwards. The tendency people have is to work until it makes sense and they say, I've got it. That is not the way to get through an economics class. So, A, yeah, we'd like for that to happen. That's not what's going to happen. B, controls rents at constant and affordable rates or levels. Is that what we would like to happen? Sure, we would like rents to be constant. We'd like them to be affordable. Part of the intentions behind rent control is we intend for people to be able to afford these apartments. But that's not what it actually does. What it does is it prevents rents from rising to equilibrium levels. Okay? Notice in this graph, where is the affordable rent? Okay? We don't talk in terms of affordable. Okay? The only concept that's really relevant here is the equilibrium rent. Because if we let the rent go up to the equilibrium level, then quantity demanded and quantity supplied are going to be equal. If we have a rent control law that keeps the rent below that level, then we're going to have a shortage. Okay? What is affordable is totally irrelevant. If we are interested in what is going to happen, okay, then we need to look at this graph. And if we impose a rent control law that keeps the rent below the equilibrium level, which is what rent control does, then we're going to have a shortage. We don't talk in terms of what's affordable, what's reasonable. Those don't have much objective meaning. So one tip off, if you see an option that talks about affordable, is probably not the right answer. Okay, it doesn't, C is not correct. Doesn't keep the rent above the equilibrium level. It keeps it below the equilibrium level. Okay? The people who advocate for rent control, they don't think in terms of equilibrium. They think in terms of affordable. But if we're interested in understanding what's actually going to happen, then we have to have uppermost in our mind this idea of equilibrium. And if you're thinking in terms of equilibrium, then you want to be drawing a graph that will show you that equilibrium. If you're just thinking about it, you've got it in your mind, you can easily make mistakes. Once it's down there on paper, it's much easier to catch any errors that you make. 19. Notice all of these really so far are just applications of the basic supply and demand analysis. And you have to understand that. You have to be able to use that analysis to get out of an economics class. 19. At a minimum wage of $8, okay, remember what a minimum wage is. Government is saying to employers, you cannot charge or you cannot pay your workers less than this. So the minimum wage is a minimum legal wage. Employers can certainly charge more than or pay more than that. They can't pay less. So here we're asked, how many workers will firms be willing to hire? Okay? Got to be careful that you answer the question that is being asked, because it could ask how many workers are willing to work. It could ask what will the equilibrium be? A lot of different variations in this question. This is asking firms will be willing to hire how many workers. So you look at the graph. I'd recommend first thing you do is look at the equilibrium. The equilibrium is at the intersection. You can see the equilibrium wage is going to be $6. Think about what it means for the equilibrium wage to be $6. It means that apart from government intervention, the wage is going to go to $6. There are market forces that are pushing us to $6. Okay? If the wage were below that, then it would get pushed up. If it were above that, it would get pushed down. Okay? So the wage will be $6 if there's no minimum wage. Here we're saying if we do have a minimum wage of $8, we got to figure out what will happen. Market forces are pushing us towards $6, but if the minimum wage is $8, then the government is saying $6, that's not legal. Okay? The closest we can get to the equilibrium wage then would be $8. It's legal to for firms to pay $8 or anything higher, okay? But they're going to end up paying the wage that is as close to the equilibrium as we can get. And so the actual wage that is paid will be $8. So you then, simple matter to say, well, if the wage is 8, what will the quantity demanded be? How many workers will be demanded? And you read horizontally over to the demand curve. You read vertically down, and you see 25, which means given that wage, the number of workers that firms will want to hire is 25. So that is going to be the answer. Okay? But I encourage you to also be sure you understand the whole graph. What if it had said at a minimum wage of $8, how many workers will want a job? Then you'd read over to the supply curve, you'd read down, and it would be 45. If it had asked, how much unemployment will there be if the minimum wage is $8? Then you would simply say, well, there'll be workers who trying to supply 45, only 25 of them are going to find jobs. So what's the unemployment? It's going to be 20. Okay? That excess supply of labor is the unemployment. Okay? Economics is not rocket science. It's not all that hard, but there's a model that you have to really understand. And if you don't understand it, or if you don't use it, then it's just incredibly confusing. So if it seems like this is incredibly confusing, it probably means there's something basic about the model that you are missing. If you're in that situation, come see me either before class or after class, and I'll be happy to go over it with you, because this is not all that hard. The people I find who struggle with it exam after exam, usually it's because there's something fundamental that they're doing wrong. And once they change that, then their scores improve dramatically. So if you're having trouble, come see me. Number 22, again, minimum wage. But now we want to know, what is the dead weight loss from the $8 minimum wage? So again, take your time. Look at the graph, say, okay, the $8 is going to be the wage that's paid. Number of workers who will be demanded, who will be employed, will be 25. You'll have 45 who want to work, okay? But actually that number is not going to be important. The dead weight loss from the minimum wage has to do with what are we losing because of the minimum wage. So here you have to ask, well, if we didn't have the minimum wage, where would we be? Well, without the minimum wage, we'd be in equilibrium. So we would be here. You'd have 35 people working, but because of the minimum wage, we have only 25. So the dead weight loss is going to be associated with these last 10 people who would be working without the minimum wage, but because of the minimum wage, they're not working. So the question is, well, what are we losing? The fact that those last 10 people aren't going to be employed, what are we losing from that? And the way to answer that would be, well, for these last 10 people, what is the benefit of those workers to employers? That would be represented by the area under the demand curve between 25 and 35. Remember, the demand curve represents a benefit curve. If somebody's willing to pay $6 for the 35th worker, that means that worker is worth $6 to that employer. So the demand curve is showing you the benefit to the employer of each worker. So when we impose the minimum wage and employment goes down, these last 10 workers who no longer have a job, the benefits that they would have provided to the employers represented by this entire area here. It's the area under the demand curve between 25 and 35. Well, what would those workers have been willing to work for? And, or what wage would they have been willing to work for? And you see that from the supply curve. Right? So the total wages those last 10 workers would have been willing to accept would be the area under the supply curve between 25 and 35. So you can think of that as the cost of those last 10 workers working. Okay? That's the cost of those workers working. The benefit of those 10 workers would have been this entire area under the demand curve. Well, you can see that the benefit is greater than the cost. And so, and the difference is this area here, which is C, what was that? C and E, okay? That is the so the answer would be C. Those two areas there, okay, represent the gains from trade that we would have enjoyed, or the surplus value that would have been enjoyed from those last 10 people working, but because of the minimum wage, they're not working. So that's a gain that we don't get because of the minimum wage. Similar to the dead weight loss when we had a tax that led to a reduction in output. Okay? We lost gains from trade. It's the same thing happening here. Okay? So C was the correct answer there. That's an important thing to get down. Okay, 28, very similar, except this may have been the hardest one on the exam. Here, you had to quantify it. What is the dollar value of the dead weight loss created as a result of prohibiting trade with foreign producers in this market? Okay? So we are trying to calculate the dead weight loss as a result of what? Prohibiting trade with foreign producers. So here you had to think about, well, if we don't prohibit trade, if we have free trade, what's going to happen? So you look at it, notice you got domestic supply. Anytime you look, you have a graph, look at it and think about what each part is representing. Try to explain it to someone. That takes time, but that's the way to really understand it. And in the long run, the way to learn economics the fastest is to really take it slow and look at each detail, try to explain each part of the graph. That takes longer at first. But if you do that, then you really develop an understanding at a deeper level. And then later on, it becomes much easier and faster and much more enjoyable to understand the things. All right. So if we have, so we've got the domestic supply shows us how much American producers are willing to supply. You've got domestic demand. That's how much American consumers want to buy. And then you've got world supply, which we're assuming is horizontal at $25 per unit, which means that U.S. consumers can purchase as much as they want at $25. Okay? So without any trade barriers, where would the consumer surplus be? Or what's the price going to be? the price is going to be $25. And at that price, American consumers want to buy that quantity, okay, which is 1,400. So remember what consumer surplus always is. It's the area below the demand curve and above the price line. So consumer surplus would be this area plus that area plus that other plus that. All of that is below the demand curve and above the price line. That is the consumer surplus if we have free trade. Where's the producer surplus?
It's that little bitty triangle slice next to
It
the.
is that's right, it's the little triangle. Remember, producer surplus is always the area below the price line and above the supply curve. So here's the price line, here's the supply curve. So the producer surplus would be this area. Okay? So if we have free trade, the total gains from trade would be all of this area plus this area. Okay? If we now impose a tariff which prevents any trade from occurring, okay, well, that would be a tariff that would shift the supply curve all the way up to here, to $50, okay? And if the price goes up to 50, okay, consumption had been 1,400. If we now no longer have any trade with the rest of the world, what is consumption going to be?
Consumption's going to move closer to the equilibrium.
We're going to move to the domestic equilibrium. Okay? So consumption would go down by 400 units, and there's going to be a loss of consumer surplus there. Okay? Plus, we're also going to have some inefficiency in that American producers are now going to expand production from 800 to 200. Okay? And what?
800 to 1,000.
800 to 1,000. Yeah, I'm sorry. It's 200 increase, but yeah, it's going to increase to 1,000. Okay. And why is that inefficient? Because here, when we traded with the rest of the world, we were getting each unit at $25 a piece. But when we now we're going to have it produced by American producers, and their costs are represented by the supply curve. Okay? So the deadweight loss is going to be this area plus this area. This area is the lost consumer surplus because consumers are going to be consuming 400 units less than before. The value of those last 400 units would be the entire area under the demand curve. The cost of getting those units would have been the rectangle here. Okay? So this right triangle would be the lost consumer surplus. The area here is the wasted resources because Americans producers are going to be producing that product at a cost that's higher than we would have incurred if we bought it from other producers. So we need to know what is the area of that triangle and what is the area of this triangle. And we remember the area of a triangle is 1/2 the base times the height. So let's look at this one first. The base, that's 400 units. So that's 1/2 times 400. The height, okay, this distance here, going from 25 to 50. So that would be 25. That's going to give us the area of this triangle. Now we need the area of this triangle. And that's going to be 1/2 times the base. Here the base is 200. Okay, we're talking about 200 units. And the height of that triangle is the same, $25. If you work that out, you come up with $7,500. That is the dead weight, and that's our estimate of the dead weight loss resulting from no longer being able to trade with producers in other countries. That's the inefficiency that we're going to experience. That was C. Okay. And yeah, I would say that was the hardest question on the exam, because you had to recognize what would happen with trade, then you had to recognize what would happen without trade, you had to recognize the dead weight loss areas, and then you had to do the calculations. That was tough, but it'll be good to know that for the
I don't remember which
next exam.
answer I chose.
Hmm?
I don't remember which answer I chose on the test. It doesn't really matter. I guess I'll find out when I look at my grade.
Yeah. All right, number 30. I hope we should be able to get through with these, and then we will get into chapter 11 some. But there's a good chance that before the next exam, I will just record a lecture to make up for the time that we're missing right now. Okay, eliminating tariffs on imported sugar would. Okay, so here you have to think about what do tariffs do, and then think about, okay, if we take them off, what is that going to lead to? What do tariffs do? They raise prices. So if we eliminate tariffs, then that's going to cause prices to go down. Okay? So you got to think through this one step at a time. You can't just look for an answer that sounds good. Which of these would be correct? Harm domestic consumers. Are consumers hurt when the price of products go down? No, they're definitely not hurt. They're made better off. Cause resources in the sugar industry to be allocated to inferior uses. Okay? No, tariffs cause resources to be used in inferior ways. But if we take off the tariff, then that encourages producers to reallocate resources and use them in ways that are more productive, more efficient. So that's not right. Cause resources to be reallocated from sugar production to higher valued uses. That is correct. When you have the tariff, the government is artificially inducing the U.S. producers to produce the sugar. Okay? But when you take the tariff off, then the producers have an incentive to look at the true values of producing sugar and producing something else, and they're going to reallocate to those things that have a higher value. And then D, allow U.S. Producers to sell more sugar. Now, when the price goes down, the U.S. producers are likely to, they're going to cut back or may even go out of business. So C is the correct answer.
I think I got that.
32, the U.S. bans the importation of Japanese automobiles. Okay? Generally, whether we're banning the importation of something or imposing a tariff on something, they all have the same general effect. It's a protectionist policy. So what is going to happen? There will likely be more U.S. auto workers. We're protecting U.S. producers from competition from Japanese cars. There'll be more U.S. auto workers, but fewer Americans working in other industries. Okay? If we're protecting U.S. producers, we're making it more profitable for U.S. producers to make cars. So they're going to produce more American cars, and we're going to have more people working in the U.S. auto industry. But we're going to end up with fewer people working in other industries. We said that Protectionist policies don't lead to an increase in total employment. They increase employment in one area, one industry, but they reduce employment in other industries. So A would be correct answer. Yeah.
You have a balloon and you compress one side of the balloon and the non-compressed side expands.
Possibly. That might be a good analogy. You have to be careful with analogies. I would have to think about before I would want to endorse that. B, again, once you find the right answer, once you find what you think is the right answer, don't automatically go to the next question. Look at all the options, because you may find another one that seems right. You may find that what you thought was right at the beginning isn't actually right. So always read all the options. Everyone in the United States will be much better off. Okay? Well, no, we've said that protectionist policies create inefficiency, which means somebody is going to be worse off. U.S. producers of cars will be worse off because their producer surplus shrinks. No, if U.S. producers of cars were going to be worse off, then they wouldn't be lobbying the government for protection. Okay? The producers rightly believe they're going to be better off if they are protected. So they're not going to be worse off. U.S. consumers of cars will be better off because their consumer surplus increases. No, U.S. consumers are going to be paying higher prices, and so they are going to be worse off. Their consumer surplus is going to go down. 34. When patients or farmers choose whether to use more antibiotics, they compare. Okay. Key idea that this is chapter 10, which I think people seem to have significant trouble with. The idea is that when we go, whether we're talking about consumers or producers, we look at, if I go into this transaction, what is the benefit I'm going to get? And what is the cost I'm going to bear? And those benefits and costs that I'm going to bear, we call those private benefits and private cost. Whereas social cost and social benefit would also include any external benefits or cost. If there are no externalities, then life is relatively simple. If there are no externalities, then the demand curve shows us the social benefits from consuming the product. And the supply curve shows us the social cost of producing the product. That's all there is if there are no externalities. But if there are external benefits, then that means the demand curve represents only the private benefits. And the social value curve is going to lie above it. If there are external costs, then the supply curve no longer represents the social cost, it represents only the private cost. And the social cost curve is going to lie above, somewhere up here above the supply curve. When patients or farmers choose whether to use more antibiotics, they compare private benefits with private cost, which is going to be option D. Their private benefits with the market price, because the market price represents the cost, the private cost to the consumer. Both the patients and the farmers are not looking at social benefits or social costs. Okay? Each individual is focusing on what's the benefit I'm going to get, what's the cost I'm going to get. Okay? Now we are making an assumption there that people are not taking into account these external effects. And I think that's a pretty good assumption 99.9% of the time. Oops. 36. Okay, here we are, you're told this is a market with external cost. The figure displays a market with external cost. The efficient level of output would eliminate the dead weight loss area of what? Okay. Remember we said the supply curve represents the private cost. The social cost curve includes the externality. When we're trying to determine what would be most efficient, then we are looking at the social benefits and the social cost. So we're going to use not the supply curve, because that does not include the externality, but we're going to look at the social cost curve here. Okay? And the demand curve, since we're not told there's an external benefit, the demand curve is representing not just the private benefit, but also the social benefit. The efficient outcome is going to be where the social benefit is equal to the social cost. So that's going to be the intersection of the demand curve and the social cost curve here. So that's going to be right there. That's going to be the efficient quantity. That's a quantity of Q0. Okay? We're not saying that's where the market will be on its own. If government doesn't intervene at all, we're going to be at the intersection of supply and demand, which would be here. Okay? So here we're talking about efficiency. Okay? And efficiency is where the private benefit equals the social benefit equals the social cost, which is going to be here. Output is going to be Q0. And that would eliminate the dead weight loss area. Okay? What's the dead weight loss area? Well, we're talking about a market where there's an external cost. Producers are engaging in an activity where they're imposing a cost on someone, but they are not taking that cost into account. We said when there are external costs, we're going to get overproduction. We get more produced than is efficient. We're getting Q1 produced. It would be better to have Q0 produced. So the question really is, well, what is the inefficiency associated with this amount of overproduction? Okay? And if we're talking about efficiency, you're always going to be thinking in terms of benefits and cost. These extra units, what's the value of those extra units? We always find value by looking at the demand curve. So the value of those extra units would be the area under the demand curve between those two quantities. Okay? That's what those extra units are worth. What does it cost to produce those extra units? That would be the area between those two quantities under the social cost curve. So you've got this area here is what those extra units are worth, but the cost is this bigger area. The cost of those units exceeds the benefits. And you can see the blue area exceeds the red area by this area here, which is area G and area H. Okay, so that G and H represent the dead weight loss due to overproduction that's occurring because of these external costs. Okay? That's kind of complicated, but it's an idea that you can understand. It just, some things, it takes longer to grasp them than other things. And if you give up trying to understand it prematurely, then you don't understand it. Okay? You can understand that. If you need help with it, come see me, because it is understandable, but it does take time. All right. 38. Which point represents the efficient equilibrium? Okay, well, if we're talking about efficiency, then we're thinking in terms of social benefits, social cost. Here, just look at what you have. You've got a supply curve. You know, the supply curve always represents the private cost. If you have an externality, then you have to have a separate social cost curve to take that external cost into account. So clearly, since you've got a social cost curve that's separate from supply, that indicates that there is an external cost here. We've only got a demand curve. We don't have anything else. So that means that the demand curve is representing not only the private benefit, but also the social benefit consumer or people are getting, because there's no indication there's any external benefit here. So efficiency is going to be at the intersection of the demand curve and the social cost curve. Which means it's going to be at this point here, which is quantity Q1, point C, which is option D here. Okay. Really important to have clear in your mind the difference between the market equilibrium, which is always at the intersection of supply and demand, and the efficient outcome, which is going to always be at the intersection of social cost and social benefit. Okay? If you have an external cost, then you're going to have these two separate cost curves, supply curve and a social cost curve. If you have no external benefits, then the demand curve will be the social benefit curve. If there had been an external benefit, then there would be another downward sloping curve here, which would be the social benefit curve. Okay? That's complicated, but you spend some time on it, you'll understand it. Spend more time on it. At 39, in the case of an external cost, the social value curve lies blank the demand curve. Okay? External cost has to do with the supply side of our model. Okay? You've got supply. If there's an external cost, then to find the social cost curve, you have to add the external cost in. Let's say it's $10 per unit. So you would have to add $10, and that would give you the, by adding in the external cost, that would give you the social cost curve. But having an external cost has no bearing on the demand curve. If the externality is on the cost side, then the demand curve, which is always showing you the private benefit, will also be the social benefits. Now, if this had said, in the case of an external benefit, if we change the cost there to benefit, then the social value curve would lie where? If there's an external benefit, then to find the social value curve, you have to add that benefit in. So if there were an external benefit, then it would be above the demand curve. Okay? Whereas here, since we're talking about external cost, then the social value curve lies on or with the demand curve. Okay? Getting those details down, really important. 40. If a can of sardines creates a noxious odor for non-sardine eaters equivalent to $1 per tin, okay, a $1 per tin tax on sardines would, okay, if something is creating a bad smell, then that's an external cost. Okay? The problem with an external cost is that it's a cost that the parties making the transaction don't take into account. Remember, we said that one way the government can deal with an external cost is by imposing what is called a Pigouvian tax. The problem is that the producer of sardines is creating or when the producer produces this product, it's imposing a $1 cost on other people. So one way the government can deal with that is to impose a $1 tax on the product, because that way the tax is basically substituting for the external cost. Normally, we would say that taxes create a deadweight loss. Taxes create inefficiency. But when you have an external cost, that creates an inefficiency. When you have an external cost, that leads to overproduction. When you impose the tax, that offsets the external cost and potentially can give you a perfectly efficient outcome. So here, A is not correct because it's not going to create a deadweight loss. Let me draw a graph here. Okay, we got the externalities. So this would be the social cost curve. Let's say we're here at 150. Let's see, the efficient quantity would be 100. Okay. So if government does nothing, we're going to be here producing too much. If the government imposes a tax equal to the amount of the externality, then that tax shifts the supply curve up by the amount of the tax. And so the supply curve shifts up to the social cost curve. The equilibrium would move to the efficient outcome. So the tax doesn't create a deadweight loss here. It will decrease the deadweight loss, but the second part is not correct because it is going to correct for the externality. This is not correct because it doesn't create a deadweight loss. It's going to decrease the deadweight loss by correcting the odious externality. Okay? That's the idea of a Pigouvian tax. Okay, 42, almost done. Private markets fail to reach a socially optimal equilibrium when external benefits are present because, okay, let's look at the options. Private cost exceeds the social benefit at the private market solution. Okay. Let's draw a graph. Demand, supply. So the equilibrium is here, but here we're assuming there are external benefits. Okay. If there are external benefits, think about what does that mean? Okay. It means that when the consumer consumes a unit of the product, not only do they benefit, but there are other people who are going to get a benefit, like a vaccine. If you get the vaccine, then you benefit, but other people benefit as well. So when we have external benefits, the demand curve does not represent the social value curve. The social value curve, to find it, we have to add in the external benefits. The demand curve is social benefit curve is going to be up here. We've taken the demand curve and we've shifted it up by the amount of the external benefit. What does that point represent? That is the efficient quantity. That's where we would like to be from a social perspective. The government does nothing. We're going to be here. We're going to have underproduction when we have an external benefit. Okay. So let's see, option A says private cost exceeds the social benefit at the private market solution. Well, the private market solution is here. The private cost is right here. That does not exceed the social benefit. It's exactly the opposite. Okay, so that would not be correct. B, private markets do achieve a socially optimal equilibrium. No, that's not correct. Anytime you have an externality, it's going to create an inefficiency. C, private benefit equals the social benefit at the private market solution. That's basically saying we're going to have an efficient outcome, which is not the case. So D had better be correct. Social value exceeds the private value at the private market solution. Private market solution is here. Okay? The private value you find from the demand curve. Okay? It's right here. What's the social value? The social value is way up here. And maybe getting the vaccine is worth $10 to the person who gets it, but there's a value to the rest of the community. Maybe it's $30. So the social value then would be 40. The social value or benefit exceeds the private value. D was the correct answer there. Okay. 43. In market X, there's an external benefit. Now just stop. What does it mean to have an external, or what will the consequences of having an external benefit be? So if you have an external benefit, you're going to get underproduction. And what was the solution to an external benefit? It was to subsidize. Yeah. If it's an external benefit, you get underconsumption and production. And the solution, or one alternative for dealing with it, is subsidy. Okay. You subsidize production, you get more of it. In market Y, you have the opposite problem. You got an external cost. When you have an external cost, then the problem is you get overproduction. we get more being produced than we want from a efficiency standpoint. And so what can the government do to deal with that, or to make it better? They can impose a Pigouvian tax, which, remember, the problem with an external cost is the producer is not taking into account all of the cost of what he's producing. You impose a tax on him and he's going to take that cost into account. Okay? So notice we pretty much answered the question, even though we haven't looked at the options yet. Okay? Don't rush to the options. Spend a lot of time thinking about the body of the question and maybe drawing graphs on many questions. And then once you've really thought about the body of the question, then look at the options. We've already seen that in market X, we really should have a subsidy. And in market Y, it would make sense to have a tax, right? So option A says subsidize both markets. No, we need to tax market Y. B, tax both markets. No, that's not right. See, it's easy. Once you have thought through the information you're given, it is often easy to find the right answer. But if you jump to all those options before having really thought about what the body of the question was telling you, then you are very much likely to make a mistake. So again, don't rush through the question. So A and B are not right. Subsidizing market X, okay, that's what we said. Taxing market Y, that's exactly what we said. So C would be correct. D, a tax of $5 in market X. No, that can't be right, because we said we need to subsidize market X. Okay, that you have to do a lot of thinking there, but each part of it isn't complicated. If you understand the basics, then you can get to the right answer at the end. And that's, you definitely want to understand how to answer a question like that before the day of the third exam. 44. This is really time. What external benefits are present in a market? What's going to happen? Well, the market is going to be inefficient, so that looks like that would be correct. The external benefit must be offset by an external cost. No, that doesn't make sense. Overall social surplus is maximized. No, inefficiency doesn't, or externalities reduce social surplus. And then D, the market is more efficient than if the externalities were not present. No, that doesn't make sense. The market will be inefficient if we have external benefits or external costs. Okay, it's pretty much the last one I wanted to get to. We didn't get to chapter 11, but we will get back to that on Thursday. Chapter 11 is really important. So be sure to read, have that read, and be thinking about the spreadsheet I gave you in class last time. I'll try to remember to put that up, dealing with implicit costs and explicit costs and accounting profit and economic profit. And I will put that up. I'll find that and I'll put that up in an announcement this afternoon. All right, let me know if you have any questions.